NATO ministers meet in Prague. Ministers agree to allow Ukraine to attack Russia. NATO foreign ministers held an informal meeting in Prague to celebrate Czechia's 25th anniversary of NATO membership on May 30th through the 31st. The actual meeting for the foreign ministers was much more significant than Czechia's membership. The meeting was most likely the last before the NATO heads of states gathering at the Washington NATO summit in July to discuss issues around long-term funding for Ukraine and increased aid for air defense, including F-16s and more air defense missile systems. However, the primary purpose of the meeting was to discuss allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons donated to Ukraine against targets inside Russia. The issue of the Ukraine weapons usage has become a more poignant issue in the last few weeks after Russian forces attacked Kharkiv, which included the use of artillery firing within the borders of Russia. Creating a policy around weapon use was the primary goal of this meeting. The flow of Western weapons, mainly originating from NATO countries, into Ukraine after the Russian invasion of February 2022 was only initially defensive in nature. The most important weapons arriving in Ukraine were mainly portable anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles that played an important role in the blunting, slowing, and eventually stopping the Russian army advance. After the initial success of the Ukraine military standing up to the Russians, the West provided more and more aid, including weapons that had the potential capability to attack targets within Russia. The West decided to impose restrictions on the use of the weapons donated to Ukraine. The West was concerned about not escalating the war with Russia. Various statements from Western leaders, including the United States, essentially conveyed the message that Ukraine should use the donated weapons for self-defense. The leaders conveyed to the Russians that they would not allow the use of donated weapons against targets inside Russia. Western leaders also stated that they did not want a war with Russia and were only allowing Ukraine to defend itself against an illegal invasion. Ukraine was aware of the restrictions on the use of the weapons and complied with the requirements, as any violation could result in the future suspension of weapons that could potentially reach the Russian border. Ukrainian manufactured weapons, along with the Ukrainian army and Russian rebels, were allowed to launch cross-border attacks. The Ukrainians have had some success using just these methods, including attacks on Moscow and Belgorod. These attacks have been more morale boosters, but for the most part, the most effective weapons in the Ukrainian arsenal are those donated from the West. The Russian spring offensive of this year has begun and is pressuring the Ukrainian forces across the front. The attack has received the most attention and has been the Russian attack on Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, has received most of the attention. The Russian attacks seem to be limited, but this attack, which also had limited success, was used as an example by Ukraine of how the West imposed limits on the use of donated weapons, hamstringing Ukraine. The Russian attack on Kharkiv witnessed troop movements within the Russian border and were off limits from a Ukraine preemptive strike or counterattack. More significantly than the immediate question around Kharkiv and its security is the overall state of the Ukrainian armed forces. The deficiency of manpower among the Ukrainians, particularly due to the postponement of a new conscription law until spring, the lack of equipment due to delays from the U.S. and Europe, has imposed challenges on Ukraine's self-defense. Western aid is now on its way, but the Ukrainians need to use the donated weapons to maximum effect to compensate for their manpower shortages, and the spring and summer offensive from a large Russian army that they have to defend against. As a result, they have been lobbying for freer use of donated weapons against Russian targets. French President Emmanuel Macron, stating in early 2024, had become the most vocal leader, calling for an end to all restrictions on the donation of Western weapons. Macron was the first major advocate for Ukraine's request, and he was a voice in the West promoting the cause. In recent weeks, Macron's call has received a new supporter in the form of the United Kingdom government, led by its foreign minister and former prime minister, David Cameron. The decision to release restrictions on the weapons use is up to the countries that donate the weapons, so the unanimous consent of all NATO members is not required. There are primarily two reasons why consensus is necessary, though. The first is that often sales of weapons to NATO members have stipulations that limit the use of advanced weapon systems. For example, US-made F-16s owned by Denmark have the restriction that they cannot sell those weapons to a third party without US consent. Many weapon systems have stipulations like this, so a NATO country simply cannot donate a US weapon system without US consent, and the US will grant the consent with stipulations that it is not used to attack targets in Russia. Some NATO countries, led by the US, are concerned about escalating the war with Russia and oppose the use of Western donated weapons against Russian soil. President Biden and his National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, are leading the cautious approach to keep the war within the boundaries of Ukraine. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is also cautioning against the use of German weapons against targets in Russia. Ukraine, Macron, and Cameron did get the support for their positions from Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, leaving the U.S. leadership split on the issue. Prior to the meeting in Prague, Secretary Blinken indicated that there would be a change in the U.S. position regarding the use of weapons against Russia. The U.S. announced that it would allow the use of its weapons against targets in Russia, but there are stipulations. The extent of the use of U.S. weapons against Russian troop gatherings on the Russian side of the border and targets in Ukraine remains unclear. The reason for the confusion is that Germany also allowed the use of donated weapons against targets in Russia. Germany made it clear that it could only use German weapons against targets attacking Kharkiv. The question is the U.S. lifting the restrictions just for Kharkiv or the entire 600-mile, 1,000-kilometer front? The question is how deep into Russia is considered eligible for attack, as well as the status of Russian airfields remains open. Will donated F-16s, when they are deployed, be allowed to conduct airstrikes inside Russia? There are still many open questions on the use of weapons that will have to be worked out, but the one point of clarification by the U.S. and Germany is that the weapons can only be used for defensive purposes to stop attacks on Ukraine. The U.S. and German decisions were not fully what the French, the United Kingdom, and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg wanted, as they were requesting unrestricted use of donated weapons. While the U.S. and Germany are signaling the restricted nature of this change to prevent the Russian escalation, France, leading the other side of the argument, maintains that Russian escalation threats are genuine and have been present since the start of the war. While it's arguably true, it is unlikely that Russia will simply refrain from responding when Western weapons target its territory. Russia has threatened a nuclear response, but it is unlikely to happen, as it would likely result in the loss of Chinese support for Russia and a retaliatory response from the West. The approval of using Western weapons against targets in Russia makes military sense and aligns with most strategies as considers the depth of the modern battlefield. However, there is a risk involved. Given that the West previously made it clear that they would not use donated weapons in the attacks on Russian soil, and now they are allowing them, it would have been better to never place public restrictions on weapons early in the war, and their use would be part of strategic ambiguity. Now removing some of the restrictions is not only a half measure, but an escalatory one that will most likely require some response from Russia. It is doubtful that it will be enough of a response to bring NATO into the war, but anything beyond that is still a mystery that the West will need to brace for.